What would happen if you take Dark Souls, put it through the prism of imagination of the developers from Gunfire Games, arrange complete anarchy, remove the usual swords, armor and magic, and cram in instead of all guns. And also different worlds and a bunch of the most unusual bosses. Then you get today's game, which we will talk about. To your attention, Remnant 2. Remnant 2 is a great example of creating your own Dark Souls. Instead of sticking to the familiar concept of big swords, shields, knights and magic, the development team decided to transform this idea and create something on their own, inheriting many of the rules from software games, but giving it their own style and uniqueness. A sufficient level of difficulty, dangerous opponents, epic bosses and revival mechanics next to local bonfires created a project that is not perfect but still came out with enough quality and fun to please players. Remnant 2 in its essence is both a unique project and not quite. After all, there are a lot of Souls-likes, and most of them don't shine with any uniqueness of their own. But still, about Remnant 2, so to say, so will not work. The developers from Gunfire Games Studio managed to make a very interesting mixture of Dark Souls with guns, but it turned out to be really unique and peculiar. This game has a very interesting setting, decent combat system, interesting locations and great bosses. The bosses are really cool to work on, because it is interesting to fight with each of them and they sometimes have a very specific look, and because of the fact that there are several worlds, you don't know what kind of creature will be on your way. When Remnant 2 came out, I knew about it only that the first part was given away in Epic Store and that it was not bad cooperative shooter. Since I had only heard about the first part, I was extremely skeptical about the release of the sequel, but still I decided to try this game. Going into it for the first time, I did not understand anything. What, where, post-apocalypse, some roots, crystals, aliens, different worlds. In general, the first impression was affected by the fact that I missed the first part from my gaze. But after continuing to play, I realized that Remnant is quite a good game and it is definitely worthy of your attention. If only because there are not so many real high-quality games coming out now. And this is, I repeat, Dark Souls, but only in which you can shoot. Sounds very strange, but the game is really cool. Today we'll talk about the recently released Remnant 2 and try to understand if it's a good combination of Souls-like with guns. In the first part, the protagonist defeat the Root, which parasitized our Earth and called all sorts of nasty creatures. But as it turns out, from the Earth, contagion chased away, but other worlds still being consumed by the remnants of the Root. And so in the second part we need to get into all these worlds and destroy the main bosses of each of the worlds, so that those worlds can breathe easy. Plot-wise, the game doesn't pretend to have any depth or anything more. Even without delving into the plot of the first part, you can see at once the dialogues here are mediocre, and the characters are just dummies with whom you can trade. So just skip this moment and rush to explore the world and dive into the combat system, because both of them are done perfectly here. You're given a hub where you can upgrade your weapons, sell various junk, buy armor and so on. From this hub, through the local red crystal, aka bonfire, you can move between worlds. These worlds are generated for each player always differently. Of course, there is a certain number of biomes, that is worlds, but the very feeling of these biomes will be generated randomly, which of course increases the replayability. But on the other hand, the project loses a bit of its identity, because in games such as Dark Souls or Elden Ring, handmade worlds are much more beautiful and they are more mesmerizing. But nevertheless, Remnant doesn't hinder this, and the locations look good and quite pleasant to the eye. And in general, if you don't know that this world is randomly generated, you probably won't notice it on the first playthrough. Worlds are interesting to explore if you love loot and everything that is connected with it. In some dungeons, you will be given small puzzles to get into this or that locked room without a key. And with the help of a convenient 3-dimensional minimap, which displays all the still unvisited places, you can easily find hidden items as simple resources that will always be useful, and use sets of armor or rings that give different reinforcements. Since Remnant is a Souls-like, the combat system should be perfectly honed. Is it enjoyable to fight here? I'll tell you that yes. The process of crushing opponents is really exciting. The impact of weapons is felt and the recoil is present. But the most important thing, especially if you play solo, is to remember about dodges. The mechanics of dodging is very important here, because there are a lot of opponents, but the ammo in your store tends to run out. At such times comes into play in close combat. It is here of course not variant, but in general, if you buy a huge brutal sword, it will be a pleasure to swing it. But still, it is better to fight at medium-long distances, because your stamina and the amount of health is not infinite. The game offers you both rapid-fire guns and carbines with single-shot rifles. Secondary weapons are pistols, both revolvers and semi-automatic versions. Well, on the third slot melee weapons are the clubs, armatures and swords with knuckles. All this stuff can be pumped for the local analogs of titanite shards. But what is more interesting is that on the barrels can be hinged certain mods that have a limited numbers of uses, but at the same time cause a lot of damage and throw certain effects on the enemy. For example, you can hinge this fin, which drill the enemy and create a vulnerable place on it, the damage to which will be increased. And when installing such a mod, the view of the weapon will also change, which is very cool and brutal looking. At the very start, you are given the opportunity to choose the class of your fighter. In the beginning there are 5, and each in its own unique way. Handler, for example, gives you the opportunity to have your own dog, which will help you. The gunslinger, who I chose at the very beginning, has the fastest arm in the Wild West, has a high rate of fire and also has an increased ammo supply. The most amazing feature of this system is the ability to change archetypes at any point in the game once you reach level 10, as well as having unique classes that are only unlocked by fulfilling secret and special conditions that the game doesn't directly reveal. As for the battles and opponents themselves, everything is very diverse. Your hero will encounter both hordes of drones and robots, roots, humanoid creatures, and other very diverse mobs with their own unique behavior patterns. The enemy always attacks unexpectedly, sometimes as a whole squad, sometimes alone, and sometimes as a squad led by some reinforced dude who can kill you with 1 or 2 shots. The scariest thing is when in the heat of battle, in full concentration, they jump on you from behind. It's sometimes very sudden and really scares you. And that's why, if you play solo like me, you should absolutely always turn the camera to calculate these freaks who are trying to grab you by the ass. In general, this game can safely be called very diverse. Just very. After all, here you're given so much content, in a good sense of the word. That gameplay you do not bore for a second for the entire passage of the game. All this at the expense of several worlds, which the developers kindly provide to your study, especially when you already wandered around the first, gloomy and desolate location of Nerut long enough, you're suddenly transported to a colorful fantasy forest with some fauns, where the enslaver of this world is a huge wolf. In contrast, after alien incomprehensible creatures, to meet a huge wolf very unusual. What can I say, even in the labyrinth, this is the place from where we open portals to worlds, has its own interesting boss, with which we are not essentially fighting, but solving the puzzle. Plus, in this labyrinth I really like the mechanics of portals. Straight portal, remember. In general, in terms of diversity, Remnant tries to show really different worlds, and at the same time, in the context of the game itself, it does not look ridiculous, but on the contrary, it makes you think what the next location or boss will be like. After all, the developer's imagination in the respect work to the maximum, and battles with bosses are very interesting and exciting. The bosses themselves, both dungeons and worlds, not to say that complex. They are interesting to fight, they are conceptually very cool and spectacularly made, but the special problems over their victory you will not experience. Compared to the same Dark Souls, from which you could just burn out and delete the game, in Remnant 2 bosses are just very pleasant and sometimes pass from the first time. Remnant 2 is pretty much the perfect game for a couple evenings. It's done really well. Battles are really dynamic, shooting is extremely responsive and enjoyable. There is a lot of loot, a bunch of different options to pump up your character, cool bosses and a beautiful variety of locations. You can see that the developers from Gunfire Games made the game in their own pleasure and tried to make a quality product, which will please both fans of the first part and connoisseurs of Souls-like and just fans of shooting. And what is the most important, if you have friends who also like Souls-likes, then in co-op I'm sure this game will be just a great option for sitting with your friends. That's why I advise to try Remnant 2 to everyone who is interested in Souls-likes or who still doubts whether it's worth to play this game. And you write in the comments what you think about Remnant 2, put likes and subscribe to the channel.